This is Big Podcast.
It's Build a Big Podcast, coming to you from Nashville, Big Podcast World Headquarters. I've got a newsletter. It is at bigpodcast.com. It is called Big Podcast Insider. It comes out every Friday. This is the audio version of that newsletter. It's got some extra commentary. It's got some things you won't see in the print email edition, but it doesn't have the links, at least not that you can click on. So for those, let me give you the URL, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. newsletter.bigpodcast.com. This is about how to package your podcast. I want you to think about these two cars, a Toyota Prius and a Tesla Model 3. It's basically the same thing. 4 wheels, fuel efficient, it gets you where you want to go. But there's a big difference when it comes to the packaging. Both make a statement, but you're going to get a different reaction when you show up in a Tesla than when you show up in a Toyota. You know ride shares, Lyft, Uber? There's actually a Tesla ride-sharing service here in Nashville, and I want you to think about that. You click on Lyft, some guy in a Honda picks you up. Nothing wrong with a Honda. Had one for years. You get to your destination, people see you walk out. It's not your car. What do you care? Well, think about the difference of that and somebody pulling up in a Tesla. Tesla means something. A Prius means something. Same car, but different experience. Something I've found with most of the podcasters that I work with is that a few tweaks to the package of their podcast can get big results when it comes to getting the response and the listeners that they want. Meaning, a few tweaks to your podcast, it's very possible that when it comes to your podcast, you will see a big difference when it comes to the listeners that you want. Sometimes that package, let's call it a facade, the outward appearance, it has a bigger difference to attracting that audience, to getting the listeners and the money that you want, than changing anything that is actually under the hood. You seen those kit cars? You used to see these, it'd be like a VW Bug on the inside, but on the outside, it looked like a sports car. Kind of fun, right? Still a VW Bug, but it gets a totally different reaction when you drive it. In this issue of Big Podcast Insider, I'm focusing on how we package what we do. Sometimes that means delivering content in a certain way. Sometimes it means focusing on what we deliver, how we edit. Either way, if you're looking to get more listeners without rearranging everything you've got about your current show, you will benefit from this information. Here's something related. A couple of days before this newsletter came out, I received the final edit of my upcoming book, which is all about packaging your podcast in a way that will attract listeners. I'm super excited to get this book out to you. I'm going to give you the opportunity to get this book free, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. That lets you sign up for the email edition of this. That is coming in the next few days. So if you want to get that new book for me free, you got that opportunity, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. I talked last week about the war in Ukraine. It's still going on, unfortunately. I've got a neat article here. It's how Zelensky made truth more compelling than lies. The non-commercial media around Russia's invasion of Ukraine, such as personal social media messaging and emails, that's been a fascinating lesson in what works as far as connecting with people in an emotional way. It's also a great example of how, even with massive resources working against you, the other team's massive resources, limited time, limited budgets, that important messages, they can still get out to people. In the last podcast episode that I published here, I mentioned that I want to connect with Ukrainians with boots on the ground to help them tell their stories to an English-speaking audience via both podcast and radio. Since then, I have gotten so many emails, personal emails, messages, people in Ukraine, from people outside of Ukraine who know people that are there, wanting help and wanting to help me with this project. It's been amazing. And it's been those personal messages, and it's been really interesting. Maybe you've experienced it. It's personal messages like this, messages that we emotionally connect with and that connect us to each other, that change things in the world. That is how powerful these things are. Jeff Sanders, 5 a.m. Miracle, he talked about getting a personal email from somebody in Ukraine, one of his listeners who had read his book and was inspired by it. These guys are reaching out and they're connecting with people like me and like Jeff and like you. And it's people getting connected to their message that is encouraging us to spread that message for them. And that is changing things. That is changing how people perceive what is actually happening. This just came out, but the hacker group Anonymous just hacked millions of Russian mobile phones and they've sent text messages to every single one of them, getting this information out. When you've got a message and it needs to get out, it can be done, but you have to be clever about it. You've got to think outside the box. You've got to connect emotionally. That's the thing that I talk about here on Build a Big Podcast and also in Big Podcast Insider. Let's talk about one way to do it. 10 proven methods to go viral. Copy and paste these templates to gain thousands of followers. This is a short Twitter thread. I love these because these are packed full of great information and it does not take you very long to read them. This will help you get more attention to what you do on Twitter, but it's also a great list of different types of podcast episodes you can create, as well as how to do podcasting and social media in general. It's a thread about connecting to people. I've got it linked, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. It's going to take you about 3 minutes to read it. It is 100% worth it. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. By the way, while you're on Twitter, I'm there at David Hooper. If you got a question about podcasting, you got a question about anything I'm saying here, just a general question, either one, reach out to me at David Hooper on Twitter. Next up, what a YouTube editor with 5 billion views can teach you. Hillier Smith is a world-class YouTube editor, and he's got some great advice that you're going to find helpful for your podcast, including do pro intros. In videos, sometimes you'll see a logo, you'll hear a stinger, pew, pew, something like that. I've got an audio version of that on this podcast. Do they work? He's got thoughts on that. Should you ask for subscribers? You hear me talking about that. What do I say at the very end of every episode here? If you want to subscribe, bigpodcast.com/subscribe. 3 buttons. You've heard me say that. By the way, if you want to subscribe, bigpodcast.com/subscribe. Should you ask for subscribers? He talks about that. What is the best way to deal with trolls? He knows a thing or two about that. 5 billion views on his videos. And also the best place to get legal music for your YouTube videos and for your podcast. Also some really good information about editing that will help you to make your podcast episodes more compelling. If you wanted a power move for your podcast, something that's really going to get listeners engaged with you, grow your audience, editing is it. Because if I can give you the same information in 10 minutes that other people are doing in 15 minutes, you're going to think, man, this guy's smarter. He's getting to the point. He's more engaging. He's really helpful. I'm not putting that filler in there. And that filler, if you think about it, think about the density of your podcast. If I've got 90% great content as opposed to 60% great content or 50% great content, people think you got a more powerful podcast. So editing, that is the ultimate power move when it comes to your podcast. You're definitely going to want to watch this video, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. That's got it linked. This is something else that's super important for you. If you've got these listeners, if you got people downloading your podcast, one of the opportunities that you have to make money with a podcast like that is selling advertising. This is how to sell advertising on your podcast. If you've thought about this and you don't know how to do it, you don't know where to start, you're going to want to check this out. This is basically your pitch to share with companies about how they can advertise on your podcast and why it can be effective. If you don't know how to approach people, use this template. It will help you. Here's what's included in this. What makes an effective podcast advertisement? Why download numbers don't matter as much as you think. If you're a podcast and you don't have a lot of downloads, let's say 500 downloads, 1,000 downloads, not all downloads are equal. You and I know that. But a lot of companies, they think, no, I want big downloads. You got to have 100,000 downloads, 10,000 downloads, 50,000 downloads before I'll talk to you. That's what they think. This is how to get around that because not all downloads are created equal. And as he says, download numbers don't matter as much as you think. If you want a response for that, you're going to love this. How do you measure downloads? That's another thing. You're going to compare apples to oranges. You got your podcast that's got 500 or 1,000 downloads. The other guy who's looking for that same advertising money, he might have 10,000, 20,000 downloads. Apples to oranges, because it could be that he doesn't have certified downloads. It could be any number of things. Those numbers are not always correct. This is how to get around that. 3 pricing factors for podcast advertising, also important. Not every ad is worth the same amount of money. You want to maximize your money, you're going to want to look at these 3 pricing factors. Used correctly, this information will set you up to be the only solution for the companies you pitch. They're not even going to be thinking about the other guy. They're going to think, I got this guy. He's only got 500 or 1,000 downloads, but he's cheaper. It's saving us money. We don't have to waste all that money on these bigger podcasts, and it's also more effective for us. That's how you sell podcast advertising. If you're looking to generate revenue via ads on your podcast, you're going to want to take a look. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. That is it for this issue of Big Podcast Insider. Again, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. That's where all the links are. I've got some great information in the next issue. And also, before that, here on this podcast, I've got a 3-parter with Terry Gross's producer, former producer. It's a friend of mine. She worked with Terry for a number of years. She knows what she's talking about when it comes to guest booking, when it comes to editing, when it comes to finding a story, when it comes to the ethics of journalism. You're going to love this. She's super sharp. And if you're curious about what Terry Gross does, if you've ever asked yourself, what would Terry Gross do? We're going to talk about that, including the infamous Gene Simmons interview. I saw Terry Gross speak a few years ago, and she said, the one interview everybody asked me about is the Gene Simmons interview. This woman was there in the studio when it happened. You're going to get the behind the scenes on that. You're not going to want to miss it. Bigpodcast.com/subscribe. That's how to subscribe to this podcast. Go there. I've got 3 buttons, one for iPhone, one for Android, one for RSS feeds. So however you get your podcasts, I got you covered. Bigpodcast.com/subscribe. Thank you so much for being here with me on Build a Big Podcast. I'll see you on that 3-parter coming up. And in your mailbox, I'll see you with that next issue of Big Podcast Insider. See you soon.